Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting our students to learn what we teach. And I am Rob Alvarez. I'm the founder of Professor Game and professor of gamification and games-based solutions at IE Business School, EFMD, EBS University, and many other places around the world. And if this content is for you, then please go ahead and subscribe to our email list for free at professorgame.com/subscribe. Engagers, and welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And we are today with James Pigeon Fielder. James, we need to know, are you prepared to engage?
I am.
Let's do this. Let's go. Because James Pigeon Fielder, Ph.D., he joined CSU as an instructor after retiring from the U.S. Air Force as a lieutenant colonel. Colonel. Yes, that makes more sense. I got stuck on that one for sure. And an associate professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's also serving as a Marine Corps University non-resident Krulak Fellow for academic years 21 through 26, and is the director of professional and educational games for Mobius Worlds Publishing, and consults on organizational wargaming, crisis response exercises, and scenario planning. He researches on interpersonal trust and emergent political processes through cyber-based interaction and through tabletop and live-action gaming as natural experiments. He has also over 2 decades of experience designing, executing, and assessing training exercises in wargames for small group tabletop discussions to multi-day exercises, engaging over 5,000 participants. And he's also serving on the editorial board of Simulation and Gaming and the MORS Journal of Wargaming, and was a TEDxMileHigh speaker on games and has been interviewed on game-related topics by Reuters, USA Today, and NBC News. So many things going on for sure, James, or Pigeon, as whatever you prefer us to call you. Is there anything we're missing there?
No, that's all the highlights. That's the big stuff.
Amazing. So let's get into it and get to know you a little bit better. We would like to know, what does a day with you look like? We want to be in your shoes for a day, a week, wherever you want to go for.
Wow. So I'll say up front, if you saw me now, I've adopted the civilian life very well. I got a huge goatee, long hair. I love it. But I went from a highly structured life 4 years ago to an almost completely unsupervised bohemian academic lifestyle at Colorado State. So one of the cool things is my days basically vary all year. I'm usually happy as long as I can sleep till 8 in the morning, and after that, it's whatever happens. So I guess on an average day, let's say it's a teaching day. I teach 3 to 5 days a week, depending on the semester and the department requirements. I don't see how people can just get up and go to work. I like to, what my grandmother called, find myself. So I get up about 2 hours before I have to be at class. So let's say I have class at 9:30. So I'll get up at 7:30, 7 o'clock. So I have time to have a cup of coffee. I make my wife her tea, and then I do all my professional reading, all the major newspapers, The Economist every week. And then I have RSS feed with about 200 articles every day from various game sites, news sites. I have to have a broad spectrum of information because in addition to studying games, I also have to study what's going on in the world to teach other classes in the department. Go to class. That's probably when it comes to structuring my life, I can never, ever not be prepared for class. So no matter what happens, that is a minimum barrier. So if I were to stay up till midnight the night before, 2 a.m. the night before to make sure I'm prepped for class, that's what I have to do. So we'll go in. Typically we'll teach 2 sections in a day, plus office hours on campus. I historically have taught 2 courses at CSU, Current World Problems and Comparative Authoritarianism, although I've taught a methods course. And in the fall, I'm teaching a science fiction and fantasy literature course, which is going to be a lot of fun. That's when when I'm on campus, I do additional professional reading, meet with students, try to fit in lesson prep there. And when I come home, that's when I'll then take off my CSU hat, put on my Mobius Worlds Publishing hat, and, editing works, engaging with educators, basically, or whatever my boss, Jen, needs to advance the company. And that would be an average day. On days I don't teach, that's when I'll do lesson prep and do additional work for Mobius. And get out of the house. It's not all, I guess I implied I read constantly, which I guess I do. I need to have like a USB port inside my head or something like that. But, get around town because Fort Collins, Colorado is great, easy to get out to different, trails locally, short drive and whatnot. And then, unfortunately, I usually work 6 days a week because Saturday, that's when I'll have to catch up on if I'm doing a research. That's when I do my writing and research on that day. But the cool thing is my son Penny and I like to go to Griffin Games, a local game store that has a cafe, and we'll work together. They're also a game designer. And that kind of takes the edge off of it too. Another thing that takes the edge off a thing is I typically wear sandals, cargo shorts, and a black t-shirt every day, and that makes me happy. So for right now, it's a little different for over the summer. I'm not teaching summer school like I normally have before, but I am working on what am I working on? Oh yeah, I have to design an online course. I have to design it and record it before July 31st, which is, taking it some of my time. But again, as long as I can sleep till 8, I'm happy. So, and that's the basic day in the life of the Pigeon.
Well, now we know what you're doing regularly. So, James, we would like to know actually of a different type of day, because this doesn't happen every day for sure. We'd like to know of a time when things did not go well, when you had one of those first attempts in learning or fail moments. We could even call it your favorite one, especially related to games, gamification, game design, all these disciplines that we're going to be talking about today. But we want to be there with you. We want to not only hear the story, we want to live it with you as much as possible and take any lessons away that we can.
This is a doozy. On the one hand, it was the lowest points in my life. On the other hand, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. So there I was, back early in my military career. I was in the Army first for 5 years, Air Force for 20 years. So this is back in my Army days when young specialist fielder at the time, a young squab, if you will, I'd already done what's called a sergeant's time training, where I had to go out and do a basic exercise with maybe a squad or two, maybe like 10 to 20 people. And when they asked me to do it, I said, I'm going to kind of do not only the classroom instruction, but I want to go out and do kind of a role play exercise. And they had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun designing it. They had fun doing it, and we learned from it. The problem is I kind of got, wait for it, pigeonholed into thinking of a small group exercise. It was easy. I called it, 5 soldiers in a truck. You go out, get a Humvee, come back, a little bit of water, a couple of MREs, you're good. Well, then I was asked to do a company level exercise. That's 200 people. I did not scale my thinking to accommodate 200 people. The design was fine. The actual exercise idea I had was fine. But the morning of, my platoon sergeant comes to me and says, Fielder, where's the fuel for the trucks? Where's the water? Where's all the, I was like, oh, we'll just pick it up in the motor pool on our way out. And she was like, you can't do that. You should have organized that a week ago. I basically failed at all these logistical points to build a large exercise. Now, I want to add a point here. When I think of designing games, I think of the spectrum all the way from a, solo tabletop game all the way up to a major exercise, with, thousands of participants. So this was a middle of the road exercise I'm doing here. Oh my God. Just trying to narrate it here does not fully capture the error of my ways. Platoon sergeant was furious. I had 200 people standing around waiting, wondering what to do because the trucks weren't there. The food wasn't there. The water wasn't there. And I actually could have gotten a lot of trouble for it. A lot of trouble because it was a waste of time and effort and resources. And the thing is, instead of, how should I say? Yeah, there was a little bit of punishment involved. Nothing I couldn't overcome at the time. But my platoon sergeant taught me a valuable lesson. She said, Fielder, what you failed to do is look at the objective and work backwards from what you were trying to achieve and plan all the way up to what it takes to get that objective. You have to learn how to scale that way. And that was probably the number one lesson I learned in my entire life. Because from that day, for first rolling me around doing push-ups for a while, but then putting a arm on my shoulder and saying, let me tell you a better way. I went from being junior, enlisted in the Army, training 20 people, to just a few years later running a base-wide exercise in the Air Force with 5,000 people, working from the objective backward. It set up my entire career. Now, everything I do, not just game design or exercise design, I always think, what am I trying to achieve? And I work backwards and plot everything out. Like this course I have to design over the summer, I've had it all mapped out, like what needs to be done by what day, by what week, and whatnot, so that I'm not... Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of procrastination involved, but I know what my timeline is, and I know I'm going to land. And fast forward from that moment of failure, that set me up to retire 4 years ago at the Air Force Academy as an associate professor with 4 funded degrees from the military. That one lesson. Yeah, if I'm up at 2 a.m. pondering my own mortality and remembering the worst part of it, I don't like that. But what it set me up for, that was golden. I'm not going to give that up. That was golden.
It sounds like a very, very good lesson time, a good time to, understand new things that you didn't expect before, and a turnaround in many ways for almost your whole career. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes those small or not so small mistakes shift the way we are thinking, shift the direction that we're going. They can make such a huge difference, and that's just one of the other reasons we love to discuss them on the podcast, because they help everybody involved so much, right? Everybody takes their lesson, understands new things, takes a new direction. There's so much to take from failure, and there's nothing to be ashamed of, by the way. That's part of life. That's how we learn. That's a good thing that we are able to fail and move forward.
100%.
So James, let's actually spin this around entirely, because we're thinking about one of those times where instead of or after a big fail, whatever comes to your mind, you actually had a big success. One of those moments where you say, well, I'm really proud of how this turned out, and I just want to tell the story of what happened there. Do you have such a story?
So I've been pondering this question on the mountain, and I'm trying to make up my mind between two. Alas, the most powerful one, if you actually look up Field or TEDxMileHigh, I sort of talk about it in my TEDx talk. I can go into a little more detail here, and I think I'll go with a more powerful one. Yes, it's a repeat, but who cares? I'll be a legend. So this is an example of where a game was used to actually save lives. So there I was in Afghanistan. I was the trainer of Afghan Air Force personnel, and I was also the advisor to the 438th Air Expeditionary Advisory Group Commander. That second hat I was wearing, I basically had to provide him with force protection advice, or like if there's threats to the base, what to do and how to handle it. So it's a lot of work. I don't regret it. I certainly don't want to go back to Afghanistan. But I remember him coming into my office one day and saying, "Pigeon." And I look around, I was like, oh, he's got me. "You're a political scientist. We have the Afghan presidential election coming up. I need to know everything about it. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? And more importantly, what does it mean for the base? Like, will people die because of it?" I was like, whew. So I'll say this up much front. Voting behavior is my least favorite topic in political science. My teacher for it at University of Iowa was fantastic. I just couldn't warm up to it. I couldn't warm up to the material. So that does not matter when a colonel comes in your office and says, "I need this." I saluted, said, "Yes, sir." I looked to my trusted sergeant, Master Sergeant Morgan Schmitz, and I said, "I'm going to pull out all my material." And he said, "Sir, teach me to be a political scientist. We got this." Well, with my political science background, his intel background, we were able to put up all this material, trying to understand how voting was going to work in Afghanistan. And the big takeaway was, it was a combination of presidential election and parliamentary election. So unlike the United States, they had a parliament at the time, which is good for if you have a lot of ethnic groups and you want to ensure everyone has a voice at the table. That's better than having like two parties and majority wins. This way, yeah, the Uzbeks might only have 10 people in parliament, but at least they have 10 people in parliament. It was a little more complicated than that, but I'll leave it there for the sake of this discussion. But their presidential system was just like the United States, except for one thing. Well, two things. No electoral college. It was whoever gets over 50% wins, and everyone ran at the same time. So instead of having two people facing off, it was 10 people. So there's going to be a runoff. So first we had to understand who's going to win the first round and who's going to win the second round. On Afghanistan, we determined that people voted along ethnic lines, not party lines. So even if the Tajik candidate, for example, was Ph.D. in astrophysics, fluent in 8 languages, but the Pashtun candidate was a 10-year-old boy with an IQ of 10, the Pashtun voters were going to vote for the Pashtun candidate. So it's like we basically took the median voter theorem. I'm about to bore the audience to tears, basically saying most in the United States, people tend to vote for a centrist candidate, and overlaid that onto Afghanistan politics and found that they're going to vote along ethnic lines. Therefore, we forecast the first round, the Tajik candidate would win, but not get over 50%. But the second round, the Pashtun would win because all the Pashtuns would come out to vote for their candidate. First round, they had 10 Pashtuns. Second round, only 1. Mathematically, what it told us, the Pashtun candidate was always going to win the presidency, and that wasn't going to be good for democracy. Of course, the boss says, that's awesome. What does that mean now? I don't need to know about elections 10 years from now. I need to know about now. Got that. So knowing that forecast, we said, well, what do we do? Like, knowing that the Tajik, or confident, I should say, that the Tajik would win the first round, Pashtun the second. How do we determine where to put our force protection assets? Like, how do we protect the people of Kabul? So we literally built a board game out of it. It took a large map of the city, identified what assets we had available, and we had the players, like where the different ethnic enclaves in town were, who the security forces were, both Afghan and NATO, and what assets the security had. And then we also looked at what they had did previously in the 2009 election. And we basically played different iterations of this board game, moving assets around the board to determine what the best combination was. Now, even though, say, in wargames don't prove anything, but if you keep generating the same hypothesis over and over and over again, it tends to be telling. So having basically, short of actually going out there and setting assets up and seeing what happened, we identified a force protection posture from this game and presented our results to the colonel and said, sir, based on our analysis, we think this is where we should have the security and where they should be. And this is where we think people are going to be the most threatened in town. And we were right. So on one hand, it was awesome to me to see the colonel look at his operations officer, said, make it happen. And literally on the first day of the election and then the runoff later, watching the assets rolling out based on my recommendation and setting up. Again, a recommendation from a game. A game. And as a result of this game, no one in Kabul, not a single civilian, not a single security force member was killed or injured in electoral violence. That was unheard of. Like, my boss busted in my office, said, Pigeon, you're a freaking mastermind. And again, a game. Whereas in, 2009 election, I think off the top of my head, a listener can call me out if I get this wrong, it's like 90 people were killed or injured. So again, a game protected people. And so going from my failure of not thinking ahead from the objective to here, what does it take to prevent people from dying in Kabul and working backwards? It worked. Nice.
Big result. Talk about impact of using a game with a purpose. That's where it goes for. And of course, as you might imagine, clearly I am all for and all in for using games for different purposes. But it was not just the game, the one that helped you make this prediction. It was also combined with definitely your own expertise. Without that, the game itself by itself would not have been able to, even if you got that result, you probably wouldn't have been as confident as you were, because, you also had to mix it up with content expertise, the situational expertise in this case, to be able to trust this game. You say, well, we're validating through this, and this is what's going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yes. So basically backing up the game with actual data and research that have been done before.
Amazing. So, James, let's say that now you're facing a certain situation that you could or you think you could solve through the use of games, gamification, game design, whatever it is that you want to go for. What would you do? Like, how would you face it? What's the process that you would follow, or the thought process that you would do to get to a solution?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually have a process, a 10-step process that I'd like to say I developed myself. Some of it is from my experience, but other parts of it are from looking at the design processes from other wargame designers, both professional and entertainment. Dr. Phil Sabin, Dr. Peter Perla, Dr. Ed McGrady, basically combining all these together to say, if I'm going to design a game, I assess I need to follow these 10 steps. I'll give you a note for listeners out there. If you go to my CSU, Colorado State University page, there's a link where you can actually download my process. It's a living document with recommended games and literature and whatnot. And I update it periodically, but it's all easily fit on one page.
Nice.
And I'm just going to rattle off the 10 steps real quick. Number 1 is objectives. 2, the research to meet that objective. 3, the rules and the first design. 4, the prototype. 5, playtesting. 6, preparing for the execution, i.e. the logistics portion, the food and water, if you will. Execution phase. Debrief is number 8. Number 9 is assess. Number 10 is revise. But under number 3, rules and design, that sounds simple, but that's the most complex step. That's where I go through what are the win conditions? How many players? How much skill versus chance is it? Is it abstract or accuracy versus simplicity is what I call it? Is it a role-playing game style or a Kriegspiel style, i.e. lots of rules? How do I measure it? What's the map? What's the scale? What happens when players encounter each other? Conflict resolution. What's the full course of play? Like, think through, the game starts. Who moves first? What can they do? They do that. What does the second player do? Exhaustive. In inventory, and in my list, I tell people, and this is from personal experience, I don't have to go all the way back to that army story. I can go back to even like 5 years ago, showing up and realizing I'd forgotten dice at a convention. Dice. Inventory. Document everything you think you need, all the way down to even how many sheets of paper you think you might require, and be exhaustive. And if necessary, a glossary. And I tell you what, for both entertainment purposes and educational games, I have a published educational game in the Journal of Political Science Education. And for games that are in my classes, I follow this 10-step list every single time. Some items I don't necessarily need. For example, I like to do an end-of-course zombie apocalypse game in my World Problems course, which is 150 people. And for that one, the map is abstract. So when I get to the map portion under rules and design, I can semi-check that off right away because there isn't really a map. Like, distances are abstracted out to make the flow of the game work faster. So, but this method has never let me down. So at least not yet.
Amazing. Hopefully you will share that link with us as well so we can share with the engagers and they can check it out, whatever the current stage is, because it's a living document, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Oh, I always make sure it's the same file name, so the link is always the same.
Amazing.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
So James, we've talked about ups, we've talked about downs, we've talked about how do you arrive to your things. And to be fair, except for the last parts, which basically go into more detail of some of the things that I do, our processes look very, very much alike in many ways, and I love that. However, I'm sure that your best practice or that thing that you see that game design processes can benefit from, it's probably going to be different. So is there something that you would say, well, do this, and when you're thinking of designing a game or gaming or something along those lines, it's going to be at least a little bit better?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I just dated myself by using that term. Hey, vinyl's making a comeback. What am I talking about? Yeah, games, I find that if a game is going to fail, many times I see it fail at the objective stage. Like the designer doesn't know what they're trying to achieve with it. So I'll take a gamification example. You create this nice app with haptic feedback, balloons, lights, fireworks. That's a lot for an app, I know. And it looks all cool, and it has initial extrinsic value to the user. But then eventually, if it's not leading to some sort of actionable goal, if it's just I'm collecting points, but I don't know why I'm collecting points, the user is going to feel, well, the first they'll achieve mastery at some point, and then second they're like, well, I don't know why I just did this. And also, not everything needs to be measured with a game. This is a harder one for me to think of an example of, but I'll see. Certainly in my time in uniform, people would propose like a war game for something and say, really we just need to facilitate a discussion for this. We don't really need to set up an entire multi-day exercise to solve this. It'd be a lot cheaper when we come to the same result. And I also was at a conference, which one was it? International Studies Association back in March. And I was a discussant on a panel about using games in the classroom. And one of the presenters, I loved her paper because her paper was about failure. And I remember one of your speakers the other day talking about failure as a powerful learning tool. And she said she built this paper was all about building this fantastic game, and looking at the actual game design in the paper, the game itself was fine, but she measured the wrong thing. So when she tested her students later in the course, nothing in the game actually prepared them for what they were learning for the test. For her, it was like, she felt terrible about it, but I'm like, no, you have the bones right here for a fantastic game. Just go back, look at the objective, think about what can you change in this existing design on what you're measuring. It'll work. It'll absolutely work. But also maybe think I like to see failures presented in science, because then we all learn from that in some way. So again, repeating myself, what's your objective, and work backwards from that. That'll improve your game.
There's no way that talking about how important the objectives are is going to be too much. It's sometimes what people, as you were saying in workshops and classes, they're not expecting to go through that phase. It might seem as the most boring one in many ways, but there's no way you can get something good out of it if they're not well established. I like to use I found a picture of it's a sandwich, right? So you see the sandwich, and it's being measured by this very special instrument that measures length, right? And I always ask my students, if I was on a diet, right, how good is that measurement going to be? And of course, it's a loaded question, right? Good, what does good mean is the first thing, right? But if you're measuring the height, it's going to be probably the most precise instrument to measure the height. But then what am I going to measure that for? It's the important question to ask, right?
Yep.
So I couldn't agree with you more. Love that one, definitely. James, now that you've heard the interview, you've gone through many of the questions already. Is there somebody that comes to your mind to say, well, I'd really like to hear this person answering these questions? So a future guest for Professor Game.
Well, this is a tough one because I can't make up my mind between three different individuals. And I think these three individuals are going to bring different experiences to the table. Pardon the table, game table pun. Actually, no pardon for it. We have game tables here. So the first is my own boss at Mobius Worlds Publishing, Jennifer Scheinfeld, longtime live action role player, experienced role play game designer. But she formed the company with experienced game designers specifically to produce games that were heroic, like everybody at the table can be a hero, team-based, so everyone has to work together, and open to everyone, supporting LGBTQIA, supporting, all races, colors, and creeds. Like, we're, as a group, are frustrated at seeing that in game space, that there's all these marginalized players are left out. And from my research, studying games, the game table is perhaps the best place to overcome differences, because when people play a game together and they overcome obstacles together, it is as psychologically real to them as if it actually happened in real life. That's why basic training is so powerful. Look up the Crucible for the U.S. Marine Corps. That's a premier example. This is why people can remember playing games clearly, decades later, and they can't remember what they had to eat the day before. People, once they've worked together to overcome an objective, they forget all their differences. All they remember is that they're a team. Jennifer knows that, and she wants to make that happen in the game space. And we all believe in what she believes in. So I think she'll have a powerful message for your listeners. Second is a colleague at University of St. Mary, Dr. Mark Harvey. We co-edited, a book called Simulations in the Political Science Classroom, Games Without Frontiers. And he really was the glue that held us together for that. And he has this heady combination of experience using games in the classroom, particularly asking him about using Risk as the board game, how he edits it and modifies it for classroom. And also pop culture, studying like music, art, comics, and whatnot. And he kind of has this heady blend of then games and pop culture that I think would be an enlivening discussion. And then finally, Dr. Elizabeth Bartels, or goes by Ellie, at RAND Corporation. I keep using the word glue, but she's also a glue that holds together this growing body of researchers in political science using games as a research method. Like this Dr. Andrew Reddy, Dr. Eric Lynn Greenberg, Dr. Jackie Schneider, me, but she's published widely. She's run Department of Defense games. So if you want that kind of like more examples of games used for real life implications, she'd be a great pick for that.
They sound like amazing future guests. And let's keep up with those great recommendations and ask you about a book. If you had to recommend a book to this audience, which book would it be and why?
All right. So for nonfiction, for study purposes, for game design purposes, it's a series. Shannon Appelkline wrote a series called Designers and Dragons. It's 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. That's the series, where it's a complete history of role-playing games, all the way to from chainmail up to, I can't remember off the top of my head where it ends, what year it ends. I should have known that before ahead of time. But if you really want to see, like, not just Dungeons and Dragons, but the entire gamut of role-playing games, it's a great read. Like, I read them straight over several days. It was fantastic.
Sounds like an amazing one.
Oh, yeah. And for fiction, specifically, even though I love the entire series Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, why Game of Thrones became popular and Malazan Book of the Fallen didn't, I have no idea, because I think the latter series is superior. Specifically, Book 2, Deadhouse Gates. I actually use that for a course, another sci-fi and fantasy literature course I taught at the Air Force Academy, because it has basically anything you want to understand about the rights and wrongs of international politics or in Deadhouse Gates. And from a emotional standpoint, Coltane's March is one of the most powerful and tragic subplots I have ever read in any book series ever. And for that reason alone, I recommend that book and the entire series.
Amazing. Great recommendations for sure. And instead of recommending other people, we'd like to know a little bit about yourself. What would you say is your superpower, that thing that you do at least better than most other people?
I synergize two powers. I read really fast. Like I tell my students, I read a book in the morning before I come to work, and they're like, how many chapters? I say, no, I read a book. So I usually read 7 to 9 nonfiction books a week, 2 to 3 fiction books a week. So I read really fast. Second, I don't get stage fright. So I will get up. You want me to talk to 2 people? You want to talk to 3,000 people? You want me to get in a stadium? That's actually my bucket list, is to be like in Wembley. Although I think Wembley closed, didn't it? But like 50,000 people. I don't even need a microphone. So the way my brother puts it, he says, so what that means is my brother knows a lot about many things because he reads so much, and he can talk about it on a drop of the hat and not be scared. So that's like, I love teaching. I love getting up in the classroom. I love keeping up with the narrative of the news going on around me, both in games and then like public life. So yeah, those two have gotten me pretty far in life.
Superpowers, for sure. And now to the difficult question. What would you say is your favorite game?
So I will admit I have put in a embarrassing number of hours in the zombie survival game 7 Days to Die, which is still in alpha. Alpha 21 is supposed to come out experimental in about another week or so. But I remember watching Romero's zombie movies in the 80s and kept up with The Walking Dead, also following the other line, the brain-eating zombies, also from the 80s, and thinking, man, what would it be like to hole up in a mall where I had to take all these resources to cover up the windows, gather up food and ammo and whatnot. Basically, in 7 Days to Die, I can live my 1980s zombie apocalypse rush, and it never lets me down. That combined, it's easy to, can be played single player. Multiplayer is primarily PvE. I'll get back to that in a second. And it's easy to mod, very easy to modify. So I have, on the one hand, I give myself a larger inventory or better guns or something like that, but I can also modify to make the zombies harder so that I can get killed in one hit. The rush, I love it. I love it. But I also agree with another speaker you had recently that I, as a public researcher and using games in the classroom, I absolutely use conflict. As a private player, I like cooperative games and player versus environment and single player. I'm not big on PvP and whatnot. And that basically that kind of the building, the tense gameplay, and the modifications, and I could play by myself or just cooperate with other players. The game doesn't let me down.
So 7 Days to Die.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that one's available already in some platforms. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. I played on Steam. PC.
Amazing. So, James, we've had you for an amazing time today, answering so many questions, giving us so much of your experience. But if there's anything else you want to say before we take off, anything else you want to mention, any final piece of advice, whatever you want to go for, this is the right time. Of course, let us know where we can find out more about you in the world of the internet. And then we'll say that at least for now, it's game over.
Haha, yes. I'm probably preaching to the dice-slinging choir here, but get out there and play a game. Open your table. Make sure your table is open to everyone. I think if we want to make a difference in the world, there's many things we can do, but when it comes to a local community, sit down and play a game. Like it brings people together. It creates friendships where friendships might not have occurred before. Even in my own classroom games, students playing together who would not normally interact, and they leave friends. Games are powerful tools. So grab your dice, people, and go out there and slay that dragon. And as to where to reach me, so you can look me up at Colorado State University, Department of Political Science. I'll have a link for that. I have a personal webpage. I don't really post to it like a blog or whatnot. It's more like a static, like, here's my CV, here are my speaking engagements and whatnot. Speaking of which, if you happen to be at a SoonerCon in a few weeks in Norman, Oklahoma, I'll be a panelist and a moderator there, and Connections Wargaming Conference in DC. Also in a few weeks, I'll be there. Find me on Twitter, J_D_Fielder. But if you look up Pigeon, last I checked, I come up number 1. And look all of us up at Mobius Worlds Publishing. Again, the link will be provided there. And LinkedIn. You can also find me at LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm all over the web. Feathers everywhere.
Amazing, James Pigeon Fielder. Thank you so much again for dedicating this time to the engagers, to this audience, to spreading your knowledge, your understanding of games, gamification, game design, and all these things. However, Pigeon, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, and thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And we'd like to know, how are you listening to this podcast? If you're doing it through a podcasting app on your phone, have you followed? Have you rated this podcast? Both are for free. And if you haven't, please go ahead and do so, because that will help us reach more amazing engagers like yourself to achieve our mission of making learning absolutely amazing using games and gamification. And if you want or need any instructions, please go to professorgame.com/iTunes. The letter I and then tunes. Before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe or follow using that favorite podcast app that you use to listen to us. And of course, listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.